Those defective General Motors ignition switches did more harm.
General Motors is connecting 7 more deaths to a
Tomorrow, General Motors will make public the results of its own investigation of how it responded to a deadly defect.
There was a time when the name General Motors meant trust. It wasn't just a car company, it was the car company. At its peak, GM sold half the cars in America. 1 out of every 2 cars on US roads wore a GM badge. Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, Pontiac. Globally, GM was the world's largest automaker for over 70 years straight. Bigger than Toyota, bigger than Volkswagen, bigger than Ford. It was the king of Detroit, the symbol of American engineering and industry. And then, a $2 part brought it all to its knees.
Good evening. Today, General Motors linked 7 more deaths to a faulty ignition switch.
It starts with stories that sound like freak accidents. Amber Rose, 16, driving her Chevy Cobalt in Maryland. A simple turn, a bump to the key. In an instant, the ignition slips, the engine cuts, power steering vanishes, brakes go stiff, the airbags stay asleep, the car crashes, silence becomes the loudest sound.
I just don't understand how they can knowingly put these cars out and still...
Wisconsin, Amy Radenmaker, she was 15 years old, Natasha Weigel, and she was 18-year-old, riding with their friend Megan in another Cobalt. The car veers off the road, it slams into trees. Amy dies that night, Natasha days later, the ignition sitting in accessory mode. Georgia, Brooke Melton, 29 years old, a pediatric nurse, it's her birthday. She leaves dinner with her parents, driving home in her Cobalt. Rain falls, a curve ahead, the engine stalls mid-turn. She crosses into oncoming traffic. She never makes it home. These weren't random tragedies. They were connected by one fingerprint, a $2 ignition switch.
I am the birth mother of Amber Marie Rose, the first known fatality of the Chevy Cobalt defect.
An angry mother. My family's hurt. I'll never forget that 4:30 in the morning knock at the door from 2 troopers. I want justice.
This car was surely a death trap, and the game of what if and when again were not ones we were willing to play anymore.
It was small, beige, forgettable, and defective. The switch required too little torque to stay in run. That meant a knee, a bump, or a heavy keychain could knock it into accessory, and when it slipped, the car shut down. Engine dead, steering gone, brakes unassisted, airbags disabled. A driver thought they'd stalled. In reality, the car had quietly killed every safety system. This defect lived in millions of cars. Chevy Cobalt, Saturn Ion, Pontiac G5, Chevrolet HR, Pontiac Solstice, Saturn Sky. Not luxury cars, not rare cars, everyday life cars. First cars for teenagers, commuters, nurses, families, which made the next fact harder to swallow. GM had known.
It made a business decision not to fix this problem, and 5 months later sold her a vehicle with the problem, didn't it?
Object to form, argumentative, lack of foundation.
You can answer.
That is what happened.
Engineers spotted red flags as early as 2001. By 2004, complaints were documented. By 2006, a stronger switch design was approved. But here's the twist. The engineer in charge didn't change the part number. So on paper, nothing had changed. Old switches, new switches, all mixed together. No recall, no accountability. And inside GM, language got watered down. A dangerous safety defect became a customer convenience issue. Convenience, the word you'd use for a broken cup holder, not for a defect that killed airbags. Why? Because fixing it would have cost about $1 per car. At GM, cost came first, safety came second. And careers? Careers stalled when you pushed bad news up the chain. One employee later admitted in the Valakas report, "There was no way I was going to be the person who stood up in the meeting and said this part will kill people." Because at GM, standing up didn't save lives, it killed careers. Inside Detroit, it even had a nickname, the GM Nod. That was when everyone around the table agreed a problem needed to be fixed, and then nobody did anything about it, or worse, the GM salute, arms crossed, pointing outward, showing that responsibility belonged to someone else. This was the GM culture. If you stayed quiet, you survived. If you raised concerns, you risked everything. So silence reigned, and the accidents continued. For years, GM's leadership failed to act. Rick Wagoner, CEO from 2000 to 2009, oversaw the company as the defect first appeared. He had been with GM for 3 decades, rising through finance, but his leadership became defined by a single obsession: cutting costs. He pushed for cheaper suppliers, cheaper parts, and cheaper cars, even as GM's market share collapsed from 28% to just 19%. He was ousted during GM's government bailout in 2009, but by then, the ignition defect was already buried deep inside the company's DNA. Ed Whittaker, who took over after bankruptcy, came from Atanted. He promised a new GM, even starred in commercials saying so, but he barely lasted a year before retiring. He never stayed long enough to confront the ignition issue. Then came Dan Ackerson, a former telecom and private equity executive. From 2010 to 2014, he ran GM like an investment portfolio, focused on profits, not problems. Under his watch, engineers and mid-level managers kept burying reports, shielding executives. The ignition defect stayed hidden, even as lawsuits and whispers mounted. For more than a decade, families were losing loved ones while America's biggest carmaker turned away. The scandal explodes. Then came 2014, the year the silence broke. GM announced a recall. At first, 2.6 million cars, but as investigations widened, the number ballooned. By the end of the year, nearly 30 million vehicles worldwide were recalled. Headlines screamed, GM knew, Congress demanded answers. Families rallied in Washington, holding framed photos of daughters, sons, parents lost. And GM, once the most trusted automaker in the world, looked like it might not survive. In the middle of it all, there was a twist no one saw coming. GM had just named a new CEO, a woman who had been in the role for only 2 weeks. Her name was Barra.
This happened. As a member of the GM family and as a mom with a family of my own, this really hits home for me. Decision we make. That is how we want today's GM to be judged.
Mary wasn't an outsider hired for cleanup. She was GM. Her father worked as a die maker at a GM plant for 39 years. At 18, Mary joined as a co-op student, inspecting fenders to pay tuition. She earned an electrical engineering degree. Later, GM sponsored her MBA at Stanford. She climbed rung by rung: manufacturing engineer, plant manager, HR, global product development, supply chain. But none of it was easy. In the 1980s and 90s, auto plants were male strongholds. Mary was often the only woman in the room. At one point, as a plant manager, union leaders openly doubted whether a woman could command respect on the factory floor. She proved them wrong. She learned to navigate skepticism, cut through bureaucracy, and win trust not by titles, but by fixing problems hands-on. Those scars shaped her. They prepared her. Because now, after more than 30 years inside GM, she became the first woman ever to lead a Big Three automaker. 2 weeks later, the ignition scandal detonated, owning it in public. Most CEOs would lawyer up, blame the past, and dodge. Mary didn't. She walked into Congress under the brightest lights in America. Families of victims sat behind her, clutching photos. She didn't say, "This was before my time." She didn't deflect. She said, "I am deeply sorry. We failed." And she didn't stop at an apology. She promised change. The Valukas Report. Mary ordered an independent investigation by former U.S. Attorney Anton Valukas. The results were brutal. It revealed a culture of silence where engineers avoided escalation, managers downplaying danger to save costs, bureaucracy so thick no one owned responsibility, executives shielded from bad news by layers of process. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was worse. It was a system working exactly as designed.
Our lives to this company, it is enormously painful to see our shortcomings laid out so vividly. As I read the report, I was deeply saddened and disturbed.
Mary responded. She fired 15 employees, disciplined others, created a new vice president of global safety, launched a Speak Up for Safety program that rewarded employees for reporting problems, and set up a victims' compensation fund that paid over $600 million to affected families. It wasn't spin. It was dismantling a culture in public.
This should have never happened.
The price was staggering. Billions in repair costs, $900 million in criminal penalties, a record $35 million fine for delaying recalls, dozens of lawsuits. But the deeper cost, you can't measure it in dollars. 124 confirmed lives, empty chairs at birthdays, texts never answered. A young Texas woman, Candace Anderson, wrongly convicted of negligent homicide for a crash. A decade later, GM admitted her car, not her driving, was at fault. Her record was cleared, her time wasn't. That's the true invoice.
Another thing that they got themselves into, but it doesn't make up for the lives that they took.
Rebuilding GM against all odds, GM survived, and Mary Barra's reputation grew because she didn't just face the fire, she walked into it. She didn't cause the ignition crisis, but she owned it, and then she used it to demand transformation. She reshaped GM's culture, gave safety a seat of power, changed incentives, empowered whistleblowers, and then she pointed GM toward the future. Mary doubled down on electric vehicles. She set a bold target. GM would go all electric by 2035. To skeptics, it sounded like spin, but Mary had earned credibility. Because when you rebuild trust through accountability, you earn the right to ask people to follow you again. The smallest part nearly destroyed America's largest car maker, but the bigger story isn't the defect, it's how leadership responded. GM's culture failed, a $2 part killed people, but Mary Barra showed accountability, courage, and change. So if you're leading anything, a team of 5, a floor of 50, a company of 50,000, ask yourself, will bad news climb your stairs? Because if it doesn't, one day it will find a way down the highway, and the smallest part will expose the biggest truth.